And we just finished a program with the Department of State, Coastal Zone Management Program. We stopped at 11 communities up and down the river. We took out some town officials who had actually not seen their river fronts from the river. They're sitting in their offices trying to decide what's best to do with their waterfronts, but they don't actually see it from the river. And
the commander was fortunate enough to have been placed on the National Register of Historic Places. She was put on the register because she's representative of the transitional phase between the steam age and the motor power age.
Hello, I'm Brian Madden. On this edition of On the River, we're going to be on the William O Benson, where I am at this moment. We're going to be talking with Doug Cope, who is the captain of this boat that goes back to 1915, and Don Nice, who has been a Hudson River painter. Also, we're going to meet the people aboard the Commander, another old boat that takes off from West Point. We'll be right back on the river.
Do you know what a yacht tender is? Well, we didn't know until we climbed aboard the William O Benson. We went along with Doug Cope of the Open Space Institute. The Benson, which was built in 1915, was named after tugboat captain William Benson, who died in 1985. In its heyday, the Benson, or whatever name it had at the time, was used to transport the wealthy from land onto their yachts. Today, the Benson, which was bought from the Maritime Center, is owned by the Open Space Institute in New York City.
the Open Space Institute was a foundation set up dedicated to land preservation, improving public access to recreational facilities and that sort of thing. They've done a tremendous amount of work here in the Hudson River in helping to purchase pieces of land that were important to public access to the river. They've done a lot of work in the Catskill Mountains, same sort of thing, preserving land up there. That's the kind of work they do.
With the sudden interest in the Hudson River as a commercial enterprise, Doug Cope doesn't foresee future problems as long as there is a balance.
Personally, I think it's okay as long as it's a good balance. You need some of the river suits itself to commercial use. I think in Kingston, for instance, the Kingston Maritime Center and Roundout Landing there is a great example of a combination of commercial use, nonprofit use, and public use. I think as long as it's balanced, there's room for everyone. But preserving it as a recreational resource, I see is most important. There's very little land available on the railroad side of the tracks. I mean, on the river side of the railroad tracks, excuse me, and should be carefully decided what's to be done with that land.
How is the Open Space Institute tied into the daily activities of the Hudson?
This boat is one of the projects of the Open Space Institute on the river. This boat's available to communities, organizations, citizen groups, and we actually use this boat as a way of giving access to the river, access to people who might not get out here otherwise. We think by exposing more people to the river, more people are going to care about the river and realize its importance as a recreational resource.
You take city officials, government leaders, that kind of thing. What do they talk about when they're out there looking from the river into the banks?
Well, it's interesting. We just finished a program with the Department of State, Coastal Zone Management Program. We stopped at 11 communities up and down the river. We took out some town officials who had actually not seen their river fronts from the river. They're sitting in their offices trying to decide what's best to do with their waterfronts, but they don't actually see it from the river. And usually what they say is, we didn't realize we had this beautiful of a waterfront, and makes them think that maybe they should preserve that.
Doug, by taking people out on the William O Benson here, have you found that there have been some programs started as a result because of what you've been able to do?
Well, hopefully there's an awareness beginning. For instance, as a result of this Coastal Zone Management Program we just participated in, the town of New Baltimore called me up, and they, a little bit later in October, they want to take out their town officials and show them their waterfront, have a meeting on board the Benson. So I think if we haven't started any programs, we've at least, I think, spawned some awareness, hopefully.
Is this something you could have envisioned 5 years ago, do you think?
Tough question.
What I'm trying to get at is, doesn't it seem that almost all of a sudden the river is becoming something to talk about, something to look at, something to be on?
Well,
more so than perhaps in the past.
That's right. The Hudson River Sloop Clearwater really started it all. They started the let's get people on the river and the awareness program. Let's show people what a beautiful resource we have here and work toward preserving and protecting it and cleaning up the river. I think it started with the Clearwater 15 years ago. But now all of a sudden, you're right, in the last couple of years there has been a tremendous move to save the river as a recreational resource.
What about yourself? How did you become a maritime guy?
Well, I started a long time ago in Florida. I grew up around boats, and when I was a little guy, I worked on little boats, and as I got bigger, I moved up to bigger boats and been making a living at it since I was 16 years old. Moved to the Hudson Valley a few years ago and got involved in boats here and just can't seem to get away from it.
The Hudson Valley, that is a place a lot of people are discovering also, not just the river, but what's on either side of it.
That's right. It's spectacular country. I've worked in many places of the world, and we fell in love with the Hudson River Valley. The combination of water, mountains, and open areas is what really attracted me to the valley.
What do you see in the future for the river and the valley?
Oh, I have mixed feelings about that. I see the river finally maybe being appreciated as a beautiful resource, but with that appreciation comes an influx of people, more people, higher population densities. I see it on the river and the numbers of recreational boats that are out here. It just seems like every month there are more and more and more boats. So I think people will start taking care of the area, but I think there needs to be some serious planning on population growth and densities in the area.
Kind of like putting a jackrabbit in a cage.
That's right. That's right.
Also aboard with us was local river artist Don Nice, who, like artist Elizabeth Mowry, who we met in Logbook 4, also hiked to find Lake Tear of the Clouds.
Late May, and it was actually, there was still some snow on the trail going up, and it was quite cold, so we walked up, and I was amazed just how small it is. It's a small little area, and actually the outlet for the Hudson River is about 6 feet across. You can actually take a couple of rocks and step across, but my sense of it was that not only Lake Tear of the Clouds, but every little stream, or the snow itself was feeding this magnificent river. So you really had a start, something that was wonderful.
What was the attraction? What was the lure that took you there?
Well, as I said, I really wanted to get the total experience. Of course, I was very familiar with Winslow Homer's paintings, and I've been searching for a way to not to necessarily copy, but at least to get that sense of painting the Hudson River painters had. Because as you know, when they came over here from Europe, mainly the people that first started painting here came from a tradition that everything was systematized. You would go out and if you've been in Wales, for example, you go out and there's a pasture, but it has hedgerows. Everything is geometrically organized. And when the Hudson River painters came and they would open up the bushes, they didn't know what they were going to see. And so it's that sense of being out in the wilderness and being in nature. And what I found out for myself was that in being on the river, you really learn to appreciate how remote it is. I mean, very few people are actually on the river, so that you, after being on the boat for about a week and a half, your whole vision starts to slow down, so you start to see more and more. And that in itself was for me, a tremendous learning experience.
You say not many people are on the river. That's basically during the week, but weekends it's becoming almost too crowded out here. Did you discover that?
On the weekends, yes, you definitely could tell when the weekends were coming, for sure. But certainly and I think it was a sense of speed, and the sense that we drive in a car and we fly in airplanes, we move so fast. And in that time, the painters only moved at the rate one could walk or ride a horse. So
Stroke a brush.
Yeah, or stroke a brush. So their whole sequence was different than ours. So I tried to calm myself down to get down to the point where I could at least come in contact with that time span.
Have you been on other rivers?
Well, I was raised in California, so I've been on many rivers in the upper part of, for example, in the Sierra Nevadas, I've been on many rivers. We just finished a bike trip in France in which we followed the Dordogne River, and there again going on a bicycle. You see, the whole rhythm was slowed down so that bike came more in contact with it. But the Hudson is very special. My wife and I have traveled quite a bit, and we always seem to come back and enjoy being back on the Hudson River again.
What do you think it is here?
Well, I think it's that the river is a great artery, that held people together commercially to begin with, and I think now is becoming an artery out of the urban area where people can come out and get in touch with, not necessarily with nature, but with the earth, with the things around them.
Aboard the William O Benson with Doug Cope of the Open Space Institute. Next up, cruising on the Commander.
They have a strict schedule.
Welcome aboard the MV Commander. MV, by the way, for motor vessel. Built in 1917 in Morehead City, North Carolina. This vessel ran in Sheepshead Bay for 65 years. Today, Commander is part of Hudson Highlands Cruises Corporation and spends a great deal of time at historic West Point. The day we ventured out, owner Gene Wart was on hand to introduce us to the old girl.
The Commander was fortunate enough to have been placed on the National Register of Historic Places. She was put on the register because she's representative of the transitional phase between the steam age and the motor power age. Her lines are built on the steam age lines, but her motor was one of the first fuel vessels that were built. We originally had a gasoline engine, and then now we have a diesel engine. The engine was changed to diesel about 5 years after the Commander was built in 1917. But she's a wooden boat built of stout oak and pine, and very trustworthy.
The Commander had been working as a passenger ferry from Sheepshead Bay to Far Rockaway ever since she was decommissioned from the First World War in 1919. So how did she make the transition to the Hudson?
The Hudson River is very special to me because I live on the river. I live right on the river in Fort Montgomery, just above the Bear Mountain Bridge. And my husband, we moved here 6 years ago. My husband would go off to work down to Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, and I was looking for a job. And first of all, I started out as a tour guide at West Point, and I loved the job. I loved meeting the people coming in and telling them about the area. But I really didn't like riding around on a bus, and I thought being on a boat would be much nicer, much more pleasant. And I kept looking out on the river, and the people, especially the senior citizens, would tell me about days gone by when there had been a lot of boats on the river, and I thought it'd be a nice thing to start up again. And that's why I wanted a historic boat, too.
A large undertaking then.
Oh, yes. It was a big undertaking for me because although I had worked for a shipping company before and I had worked in tourism development before, I had never done anything just quite like this. And so anything you do for the first time is always more difficult. We were fortunate to have some very good people with us. We are 15 shareholders, and each one of them brings a unique talent to the operation. So we had a lot of help from our shareholders. We all put a lot of work in the beginning when we didn't have any money. Now that we're making a little more, we can afford to pay for deckhands, captains, and a little more help. So we don't have, but there's always one of the owners on board on every cruise. We feel that gives it the personal touch.
The Commander has been on the Hudson for 5 seasons now, and it's seen plenty of renovation, or should we say restoration.
Being on the National Register of Historic Places, we have to be very careful that we don't change the character of the boat. On the upper deck, things are pretty much the way they were, except we have had an actual new upper deck put on. We had that done up in Kingston at the Maritime Center. Andy Mealy did that and did a very fine job. We put the canopy up over the rear portion of the upper deck because we do get a lot of senior citizens on board and they don't always want to be in the full sun. And of course it keeps out the rain if we do get any rain too.
The day we joined Jean, there was a group from Pennsylvania on board, but every day is different on the Commander.
We have varied groups on board. We do everything from floating classrooms for school children, where we teach them about the history of the river and the ecology and the nature and the sights. We have senior citizens who come on for champagne cruises with old-time dancing, where we have a one-man band. They love that. In the evenings, we do charter cruises for corporations, for civic organizations, such as your Lions Clubs, your Rotaries, Garden Club, historical groups. We have a lot of private parties, birthday parties, anniversaries, weddings. Weddings are a big thing on the boat. I think we're back in the age of the romantic era because people seem to love the boat for weddings now, and we've had weddings and wedding ceremonies on the boat. We've had some very special people on the boat too. We had Helen Hayes, who had her 82nd birthday on the boat and brought a lot of her old friends, such as Lillian Gish and a number of other actresses and actors. We led the parade of boats in the Brooklyn Bridge Centennial, so we were very proud to do that. And the following day we had the Roebling family who built the Brooklyn Bridge on board. So we've had some very interesting people.
The Hudson Highlands is a unique part of the river, well protected with the high mountains and the depth of the river at West Point, 175 feet to be exact. There isn't much turbulence, yet it's still fairly difficult navigation. However, it seems to be no problem for the Commander's confident captain, Colin Key.
Because I love the older boats, the wooden boats, the steamboats. And, they're mostly gone, and there aren't all that many people who can remember them today. The Hamilton was the last side wheeler on the river. It was powered by steam and had paddle wheels, one on each side. It was built in 1924 to run between New York and Albany, one of the fleet owned by the Hudson River Day Line. I started work on the Hamilton as an assistant purser, became chief purser, handled all the money, first aid, and the business matters of the vessel. And then when I got my license, I became first mate. The Hamilton last ran on the river in 1971. She was the last side wheeler on the Atlantic seaboard to still be in service. There's one side wheeler preserved on Lake Champlain named the Ticonderoga. If you ever visit that, you get an idea what the Hamilton was like. They replaced it with the present diesel propeller boat named the Dayliner. The old Dayline named all of its boats after people connected with the Hudson River, such as Hendrick Hudson or Robert Fulton. Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel on the bank of the Hudson in Weehawken. So that was his connection with the river.
That little train station at the dock that we just left was used for the shooting of the movie The Long Gray Line. In years gone by, all the new cadets, or plebes as they call them, were brought in here by railroad train, and they double-time them up the hill to give them their first taste of military life. Nowadays, of course, they all come in by bus. These guys are cute. They think they're going to college here. They need a congressional recommendation to go here. They come from all over the United States. A lot of famous people went here. Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, most of the officers from the American Civil War on both sides attended West Point. They were classmates here, and they were shooting each other when they got down the Mason-Dixon line. George Custer attended West Point. He's buried up there. Chris Christopherson was here. Arthur Ashe, the tennis pro, was stationed here. A famous dropout of West Point was Edgar Allan Poe. Ask me why he dropped out. He had Poe grades. Now, Edgar Allan Poe was an eccentric genius, of course, but he was an alcoholic, and they had a funny-looking uniform in those days, and he was always being chastised for being out of uniform. They had a large white sash across the chest and a funny-looking hat, and one day he showed up on the parade ground with the large white sash and the funny-looking hat and nothing else. A summer house. That summer house was used for the shooting of the movie Hello, Dolly, starring Barbra Streisand. In fact, they turned the whole riverfront area here into a replica of Yonkers, and when they tore it all down, they left that little gazebo there. This is the deepest part of the Hudson River, incidentally. It's over 175 feet deep at high tide. If you go down here, they don't find your body, so stay on the boat.
Now let's meet the face behind the voice. Your guide on the Commander, Mike Skane.
I've been with them from the beginning. I came down to do a little woodwork and a little painting on the boat, and when they set sail, they asked me if I wanted to be a deckhand. I said, sure.
And this is not all Mike does for a living.
I work in New York when I can get a job, you know, and I've been lucky in some places, and it's a typical acting career, you know. You have to put up with a lot of cattle calls and curtain calls and stuff like that. The agency will send you on a call, and they'll ask for tall baritones with a mustache. There'll be 150 guys who look just like me, so you don't know.
So what is the attraction here for Mike?
We run May 1st to October 31st. Yeah. It gets a little cold in the spring and the fall, but the colors are great in the fall. I grew up on the river down in the Stony Point area, but I never saw so much of it till I got this job, you know. And it's beautiful. I just can't get away from it, you know. And the river changes. It's different every day. It has a personality, you know. And I like its different phases and the different times of year. You know? Well, some days it'll be fog shrouded and you can't hardly see the tops of the mountains, you know, and the colorful river people and the different boats, you know, it's always different. We get people from all over the country, a lot of people from the Midwest. We just had a group from all over the world. They were members of a bar association, a group of lawyers, and they came from, you know, many different countries, and they enjoyed themselves, had a good time.
And what is Mike's favorite part of the trip?
Probably West Point area, the Hudson Highlands. It's very beautiful, the mountains. People like to see the river narrow, and they like to see the land going by for some reason. When you go further south, the river gets much wider, and the Palisades are pretty, but then you run into Sing Sing Prison and things like that, which aren't so pretty. So upstate New York I like, and probably West Point. A great deal of the Revolution was fought in the area, you know. George Washington slept in every other house you see around here, so.
And Mike tells us the Commander was part of the 4th of July festivities in New York Harbor.
We saw Op Sail down there where they had all the tall ships. And most of them are training vessels for various countries' Coast Guard academies and naval academies. And they're just beautiful. You know, the men standing in the rigging, and many of them are square riggers and barks and, you know, vessels you just don't see anymore on the river, you know. I guess in years gone by they were all over the place, but no more. There's not even any steamboats left, you know. It's a bygone era, you know, no more side wheelers. There used to be the day liners and the night line, which ran to Albany. and they would take the lawyers from New York up to the state capitol, and they'd sit on the upper deck, and it was a romantic age, you know. Now they all go up in an hour and a half in an airplane. You know? But the first mate would shine a light on the different land objects, and they could sip their drinks and do their paperwork, and they were full of polished brass and mahogany and violins and potted palms. You know, it's kind of all gone now.
And there are other tidbits Mike knows about the Commander.
It's all built out of wood. It's 2.5-inch pine planks on oak beams. And of course, a lot of it has to be replaced now and then, you know, which is very expensive boatwright work. But it's quaint and it's old. It was built on the cusp of steam and diesel. And it was one of the first diesel-powered vessels around, you know. And I guess the steam became impractical to carry all the wood and coal, whatever they burned, you know. And highlights, I guess Helen Hayes' birthday party with Maureen Stapleton and Josh Logan and Lillian Gish and, you know, a lot of movie stars. There was a lot of interesting people on the boat. But I see interesting people every day, you know. People are funny. They come to New York and they come upstate here and they say, where are all the skyscrapers? You know? And I have to explain to them it's a big state, you know. It's not Manhattan everywhere. You know?
Not Manhattan everywhere, and we've certainly been proving that. And next week we're going to extend it even more. We're going to be at the Port of Albany, and we're going to find out how the Port of Albany competes with the Port of New York City. And we'll be at the Mariners Harbor, where people can dine right on the river. Thanks for coming aboard this time, and we'll be back right here next week on the river.